The morning light from Centauri Prime's twin suns streamed to the massive transparent walls of Lecture Hall 347, casting rainbow patterns across the curved ceiling. Professor Kethvar stood behind his elevated podium, his forearms moving with practiced elegance as he organized his teaching materials. Each arm worked independently, one adjusting his holographic display controls, another sorting through specimen data cards, while the remaining two gestured expressively as he spoke to early arriving students. The professor's silver eyes held the wisdom of someone who had spent decades studying the galaxy's most dangerous creatures. His pale blue skin had the faint shimmer that marked him as one of the Altarian scholar caste, beings known throughout the galaxy for their careful, methodical approach to xenobiology. Today, however, there was something different in his demeanor, a tension that even his most distracted students couldn't miss. The classroom filled steadily as the morning progressed. Each species clustered naturally with their own kind, an unconscious behavior that Professor Kethvar had observed countless times over his teaching career. The Etherians sat in the middle section, their translucent, crystalline skin catching and refracting the sunlight into beautiful patterns on the walls around them. They moved like living glass sculptures, each gesture flowing into the next with impossible grace. When they whispered each other, their voices created soft, musical tones that reminded listeners of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Behind them, the Volcaria claimed the upper rows, their gray skin and enlarged craniums giving them an imposing presence despite their relatively small stature. They rarely spoke during class, preferring to process information internally through their advanced logical frameworks. When they did communicate, it was through subtle hand gestures and meaningful glances that conveyed complex thoughts in seconds. The granite folk had taken their usual spots near the back, their heavy, mineral-encrusted bodies requiring specially reinforced seating. Despite their intimidating appearance, they were among the gentlest species in the galaxy, their rocky exteriors hiding hearts full of compassion and curiosity. They took meticulous notes on everything, their thick fingers surprisingly delicate as they worked their data tablets. Scattered throughout were representatives of 9 other species, each bringing their own unique perspectives and natural abilities to the classroom. There were the tall, willowy fernlings with their plant-like skin that changed color with their emotions, the 6-legged hexapods whose compound eyes could see across multiple light spectrums, and the floating, jellyfish-like nebulans who communicated through bioluminescent patterns across their translucent bodies. And then there was Jake Mitchell. The human sat alone in the front row, seemingly oblivious to the careful distance other students maintained from him. At 23, Jake was younger than most graduate students, but his acceptance into the advanced xenobiology program had caused quite a stir throughout the university. Earth was still considered a backwards, primitive world by most galactic standards. The fact that they had developed spaceflight at all was viewed as something of a miracle, given their planet's reputation as a death trap. Jake looked unremarkable by human standards. Average height, brown hair that he kept slightly too long, and brown eyes that seemed to notice everything around him. He wore simple clothes, a plain blue shirt and dark pants that looked almost primitive compared to the advanced fabrics worn by his classmates. While everyone else took notes on sleek data tablets that could store a vast amount of information and connect to the galactic network, Jake used an old-fashioned paper notebook and a simple ballpoint pen. Most of his classmates assumed this was because humans lacked the technology to create better writing instruments. They didn't realize that Jake preferred paper and pen because he could write faster by hand than he could type on the unfamiliar alien interfaces. They also didn't know that he had deliberately chosen the front row seat not out of academic enthusiasm, but because it gave him the best view of all potential exits from the room. Professor Kethvar had been watching Jake with particular interest since the semester began. The human's academic performance was stellar, but there was something else about him that the professor couldn't quite identify. Jake approached every topic with the same calm, analytical mindset, whether they were discussing the mating habits of harmless flutterwings or the hunting techniques of the galaxy's most feared predators. Other students would show visible reactions during particularly intense lessons, but Jake remained consistently composed, taking notes with the same steady hand regardless of the subject matter. As the final students filed into their seats, Professor Kethvar felt his pulse quicken slightly. Today's lesson would be unlike anything he had ever attempted in his 40 years of teaching. The administration had initially refused his request, calling it too dangerous and unnecessary. It had taken months of careful planning and multiple safety protocols to gain approval for what he was about to do. The professor cleared his throat, and the diverse chatter of 12 different species gradually fell silent. Every eye, compound eye, and light-sensing organ in the room focused on him. In the front row, Jake looked up from his notebook, pen poised and ready, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. The heavy doors at the back of the classroom made a sharp hissing sound as they slid apart, breaking the focused silence that had settled over the students. Every head turned toward the entrance, curiosity mixed with apprehension on faces across the room. Even the normally unflappable Volcaries shifted in their seats, their logical minds processing the unusual sounds coming from the corridor beyond. A team of 4 security officers entered first, each wearing full environmental suits that looked more like battle armor than standard university safety gear. Their movements were careful and deliberate, hands never straying far from the emergency containment devices attached to their belts. Behind them came the transport team, struggling to maneuver an enormous reinforced cage through the doorway. The cage itself was a marvel of engineering, constructed from layers of different materials that Jake recognized from his studies of galactic metallurgy. The outer shell appeared to be made of reinforced titanium, while energy fields crackled between inner mesh barriers. Warning lights blinked steadily along its edges, and the low hum of multiple power sources filled the air. Whatever was inside required serious containment measures. As the transport team wheeled the cage toward the center of the classroom, students began to catch glimpses of movement within. Something large and dark paced back and forth, its form shifting and blurring in ways that made their eyes water when they tried to focus on it directly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and an odd metallic smell began to permeate the air. Then the creature moved close enough to the transparent sections of the cage for everyone to see it clearly, and the reaction was immediate. The thing inside was unlike anything most students had encountered in their biology classes. It stood roughly the size of a large earth wolf, but its build was far more muscular and predatory. Its body combined the sleek power of a panther with the broader chest and powerful shoulders of something designed for taking down much larger prey. The creature's fur was so black it seemed to absorb the light around it, creating an unsettling void where its body should be. But the fur was just the beginning of its terrifying features. Obsidian claws, each as long as a human finger, clicked against the metal floor of the cage with every step. They looked sharp enough to cut through steel, and the way they moved suggested the creature knew exactly how to use them. Its mouth hung slightly open as it panted, revealing multiple rows of serrated teeth that curved backward like a shark's. Saliva dripped from its jaws, and where the drops hit the cage floor, they sizzled slightly. The most disturbing aspect of the creature was how it seemed to exist in multiple places at once. Every few seconds, its solid form would flicker and become translucent, as if it was only partially present in their dimension. During these moments, parts of its body would appear to stretch into impossible angles, reaching toward the cage walls before snapping back to normal. The air around the entire cage shimmered with heat distortion, making it difficult to look at directly. The Etherian students were the first to react to the creature's presence. Their naturally crystalline skin began to dim rapidly, losing the beautiful rainbow refractions that normally made them so pleasant to be around. 3 of them stood up immediately and moved toward the back rows, their graceful movements now quick and panicked. Their musical voices rose in pitch as they whispered urgently to each other in their native language, the sounds now resembling alarm bells rather than wind chimes. The logical Volcari, normally composed and analytical in every situation, began showing signs of stress that Jake had never seen before. Their enlarged craniums started to flush with a pale green color, and their breathing became rapid and shallow. Several of them closed their eyes and began the deep breathing exercises their species used to maintain emotional control during crisis situations. Their usual calm demeanor cracked as primitive survival instincts overrode their logical training. Even the sturdy granite folk, with their rock-hard exteriors and reputation for bravery, shifted nervously in their reinforced seats. Their usually steady hand began to tremble slightly as they gripped their data tablets, and the mineral crusts on their skin darkened to deeper, more defensive colors. One of them made a low rumbling sound deep in their chest, a noise Jake had learned meant they were preparing for potential danger. The other species throughout the classroom showed similar reactions. The fernling skin shifted rapidly through colors that Jake's studies had taught him indicated fear and alarm. The hexapod's compound eyes dilated fully, taking in every detail of potential escape routes. The floating nebulans began pulsing with urgent bioluminescent patterns, their translucent bodies contracting as they prepared to move quickly if needed. Professor Kevvar himself maintained what he clearly considered a safe distance from the cage, his forearms held carefully away from his body in a defensive posture. His silver eyes never left the creature, and Jake noticed that the professor's normally steady voice had developed a slight tremor when he spoke to the containment team. The creature inside the cage seemed to feed on the fear filling the room. Its red eyes, glowing like hot coals in its shadow-black face, swept across the tiered seating with obvious intelligence. It was evaluating each student, measuring their reactions, and Jake realized with chill that it was actively hunting even while contained. Every being in that classroom could feel the weight of its predatory attention, the primitive recognition that they were in the presence of something designed to kill. The air in the classroom had become thick with tension and fear. Jake could almost taste the stress hormones being released by his classmates, a cocktail of alien biochemistry that would have overwhelmed most humans. But Jake wasn't most humans. While every other being in the room showed clear signs of distress, he remained exactly where he had started the class, settled comfortably in his front row seat. Instead of recoiling like his classmates, Jake actually leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the small desk attached to his chair. His brown eyes moved systematically across the creature, taking in details with the same methodical approach he used when studying any new specimen. To anyone watching, it looked like he was examining a particularly interesting rock formation rather than one of the galaxy's most feared predators. The difference in his behavior was startling. Behind him, the Etherian students had pressed themselves against the back wall, their crystalline forms now so dim they looked like clouded glass. Their usual musical communication had devolved into sharp, frightened chirps. The Volcari were struggling with their breathing exercises, their logical minds unable to process why their bodies were flooding with panic chemicals. Even the massive granite folk were making low, worried rumbling sounds that vibrated through the floor. But Jake sat still and focused, his pen poised over his notebook as if he was about to take notes on a routine lecture. His breathing remained steady and controlled, his heart rate barely elevated from its resting state. Where others saw a terrifying monster, Jake saw a subject worthy of scientific study. The creature seemed to sense this difference. Its glowing red eyes had initially swept across the room in a predatory assessment, cataloging potential threats and easy prey. But when its gaze fell on Jake, something shifted. The beast paused in its pacing, tilting its head slightly as it studied the human, who dared to study it back. For a moment, predator and human observed each other across the space between cage and classroom seat. Jake began to notice things that everyone else had missed in their panic. The creature's left rear leg carried slightly less weight than the others, suggesting an old injury that had healed but left lasting effects. When it turned, the movement was just fractionally slower on that side, compensating for what was probably chronic pain or stiffness. The way it held its head indicated possible damage to the inner ear on the right side, which would affect its balance and explain the slight adjustment in its stance. Most interesting to Jake was the pattern of the creature's dimensional phasing. While others saw only disturbing flickers that hurt their eyes, Jake began timing the intervals. The phases lasted roughly 3 to 4 seconds each, with 7 to 9 second gaps between them. The pattern wasn't random, it was rhythmic, suggesting the ability was tied to the creature's respiratory or cardiac cycles rather than being under conscious control. The beast's ears were constantly moving, tracking different sounds throughout the room. Jake watched as they swiveled toward the Etherian student's frightened chirping, then toward the Volcari's rapid breathing, then toward the rumbling of the granite folk. The creature was mapping the room acoustically, building a detailed picture of where each potential target was located and what state they were in. Professor Kevvar had been watching the silent exchange between human and predator with growing amazement. His forearms trembled slightly as he tried to maintain his professional composure, but his voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Can anyone share their observations about our specimen?" he asked, the words coming out more strained than he had intended. His silver eyes darted nervously between the cage and his students. The classroom fell into an even deeper silence. The only sounds were the creature's claws clicking against metal, the hum of the containment systems, and the various stress responses of terrified students. No one wanted to draw the predator's attention by speaking. No one wanted to be noticed. Everyone except Jake. Without hesitation, he raised his hand in the air, the simple gesture causing several students to gasp in disbelief. How could he possibly want to interact right now? His movement was casual, comfortable, as if he was volunteering to answer a question about planetary geology rather than commenting on a creature that could tear him apart in seconds. "The creature has an old injury to its left rear leg," Jake said, his voice clear and steady in the frightened silence. "It's favoring that side and compensating with altered movement patterns. There's also likely some damage to its right inner ear based on head positioning and balance adjustments." He paused, glancing back at the cage where the Shadow Maw had stopped pacing entirely, its attention now fully focused on him. "It's actively hunting us even while contained," Jake continued, completely unbothered by the creature's intense stare. The ear movements show it's mapping everyone's location and stress levels. Based on pupil dilation and focus patterns, it's already identified at least 3 students as primary targets, probably choosing based on flight response intensity and positioning relative to exits. Every head in the classroom turned away from the cage to stare at Jake in complete shock. The humans sat there calmly, pens still ready to take notes, while surrounded by beings who were barely containing their terror. How was this possible? How could someone from a primitive world remain so composed when species with millions of years of advanced evolution were falling apart? The Shadow Maw's red eyes never left Jake's face, and for the first time since entering the room, the creature seemed uncertain about what it was looking at. The first sign of trouble came as a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. Jake felt in his chest before he heard it, a deep resonance that made his teeth ache slightly. The lighting fixtures overhead began to flicker, casting strange moving shadows across the classroom that made the already nervous students even more agitated. Professor Ketvar frowned and glanced at his control panel, where several warning indicators had begun blinking amber. The university's power grid was notoriously unstable, especially in the older academic buildings, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The containment systems required massive amounts of continuous energy to maintain their multiple layers of protection. Without warning, a violent surge of electrical energy raced through the building systems like lightning through a metal rod. Every light in the classroom blazed brilliant white for a split second before dimming to half their normal brightness. The holographic displays throughout the room wavered and distorted, showing fragments of corrupted data before stabilizing. But most importantly, the steady hum of the cage's containment field began to stutter. Jake watched with growing concern as the energy barriers around the Shadow Maw's prison flickered like a dying flame. The first failure lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make the creature inside pause in its pacing and look directly at the weakening barriers. Its red eyes seemed to brighten with interest, and Jake could almost see the intelligence working behind them as the predator began to understand what was happening. The second power fluctuation lasted longer, nearly 3 full seconds. During that brief window, the containment field disappeared entirely, leaving only the physical barriers between the Shadow Maw and the classroom full of potential prey. The creature pressed against the cage door, testing it with one massive paw. The metal groaned under the pressure, but held firm. Then came the third surge, stronger than the others, and this time the power didn't return. Every energy barrier around the cage vanished simultaneously. The low humming stopped. The warning lights went dark. And in the sudden, terrible silence that followed, everyone in the room heard the soft mechanical hiss of locks disengaging as the cage door slid slowly open. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Students, professor, and even the containment team stood frozen as they processed what had just happened. The most dangerous predator from one of the galaxy's most hostile worlds was no longer contained, separated from them by nothing more than an open doorway and empty air. Then chaos exploded through the classroom, like a bomb going off. The Etherian students screamed in voices that shattered like breaking crystal, their panic overriding every instinct except the need to run. They stumbled over each other in their desperate attempt to reach the exits, their graceful movements now clumsy with terror. The Volcari abandoned all pretense of logical thinking and joined the rush toward the doors, their enlarged brains flooded with chemicals that made rational thought impossible. Chairs crashed to the floor as students fought to escape. The heavy seats used by the granite folk toppled like falling boulders, blocking pathways and creating even more panic as students found their escape routes cut off. Data tablets scattered across the floor, their screens cracking under the weight of trampling feet. The organized classroom dissolved into complete bedlam in a matter of seconds. Professor Kevvar backed slowly toward the emergency alarm panel mounted near his desk, all four of his arms shaking so violently he could barely coordinate his movements. His silver eyes were wide with terror as he watched his carefully planned demonstration transform into a nightmare scenario that could end academic careers and destroy lives. In the middle of all this chaos, the Shadow Maw emerged from his prison with the unhurried confidence of a creature that knew it was the apex predator in any situation. It didn't rush or pounce immediately. Instead, it savored the moment, breathing deeply to take in the rich scent of fear that now saturated the air. Its black fur rippled with each movement, and the way it held its head showed it was cataloging every sound, every movement, every potential victim in the room. The creature's attention settled on a young Etherian student who had stumbled during the initial panic. She had fallen near the wall, and the overturned furniture now blocked her path to the nearest exit. Her crystalline skin had gone completely transparent with fear, making her look like she was made of clear glass. She pressed herself against the wall, unable to move, unable to even speak, as the predator began moving toward her with deliberate, measured steps. This was the moment when every survival instinct should have screamed for self-preservation. This was when any sane being would have run for their life, leaving the unfortunate student to her fate while they escaped to safety. Instead, Jake Mitchell stood up from his front row seat and began walking forward, not toward the exits like everyone else, not toward safety or help or any kind of protection. He walked directly toward the Shadow Maw, his steps steady and purposeful. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his breathing remained calm and controlled even as he approached one of the galaxy's most efficient killing machines. The predator sensed his approach and turned away from the trapped student, confused by this strange bipedal creature that was moving toward danger instead of away from it. Jake stopped just a few feet from the beast, close enough that he could see the individual teeth in its partially open mouth, close enough to smell the metallic scent of its breath. He looked directly into those burning red eyes and showed no fear whatsoever. The classroom held its breath as Jake stood face to face with one of the galaxy's most feared predators. The Shadow Maw's red eyes burned with intelligence and hunger, its powerful muscles tense beneath that light-absorbing black fur. Every other being in the room had either fled or frozen in terror, but Jake remained perfectly calm, studying the creature with the same scientific interest he had shown throughout the entire encounter. Slowly, deliberately, Jake raised his right hand, not in a defensive gesture, not in surrender, but in something else entirely. His palm faced downward, fingers relaxed, arm extended just enough to establish presence without aggression. It was a posture that somehow communicated across the vast differences between human and alien predator, speaking a language older than civilization itself. The Shadow Maw's reaction was immediate and startling. Its pointed ears, which had been upright and alert, suddenly flattened against its skull. The creature's confident posture shifted, its weight moving backward as if Jake had physically pushed it. Those burning red eyes that had been filled with predatory hunger now showed something completely unexpected. Confusion mixed with what could only be described as recognition. For the first time since emerging from its cage, the Shadow Maw took a step backward, then another. Its massive head lowered slightly, not in submission exactly, but in acknowledgement of something it had sensed in the human standing before it. The dimensional phasing that had made it so unsettling to look at slowed and then stopped entirely, as if the creature no longer felt the need to prepare for interdimensional escape. Jake maintained eye contact throughout this strange dance of dominance, never blinking, never showing the slightest hint of fear or uncertainty. When the creature had backed up enough to be near its open cage, Jake made a simple gesture with his outstretched hand, a slight movement toward the prison that had contained it moments before. The Shadow Maw turned and walked back into the cage without resistance. No force was needed, no weapons or containment fields. The apex predator simply recognized that it had encountered something unexpected and chose to comply rather than challenge what it instinctively understood to be another apex predator. The cage door slid shut with a soft hiss as emergency power systems finally kicked in, restoring the containment fields and securing the creature once again. Only then did Jake lower his hand and turn his attention to the Etherian student who was still pressed against the wall, her crystalline form trembling with residual terror. The silence in the classroom was profound. Students who had been screaming and running moments before now stood frozen in disbelief, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The Volcari, with their advanced logical minds, were perhaps the most disturbed because they could find no rational explanation for what had occurred. Their breathing exercises had been abandoned entirely as they stared at Jake with expressions of complete bewilderment. Professor Kethvar stood near his emergency alarm, all four arms hanging limply at his sides. His silver eyes were wide with shock, and when he finally found his voice, it came out as barely a whisper. "How is this possible?" he asked, his usual academic composure completely shattered. Jake gently helped the Etherian student to her feet, his movements careful and reassuring as she gradually regained her stability. Her crystalline skin was beginning to show faint colors again, though she still trembled from the encounter. He made sure she was steady before turning to address the professor's question. "Earth isn't the primitive world everyone thinks it is," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "Yes, we developed technology later than other species, but that doesn't mean we're weak or helpless. Our planet produced some of the galaxy's most successful predators, and humans evolved right alongside them." He gestured toward the now contained Shadowmaw, which was watching him through the cage barriers with what looked like respectful attention. "We shared our world with creatures like lions, which hunt in coordinated groups and can bring down animals 10 times their size. We lived alongside wolves, pack hunters with intelligence and social structures that rival our own. We faced bears that could tear through trees with their claws, and big cats that could stalk us for miles without making a sound." The alien students listened with growing amazement as Jake continued his explanation. The granite folk, despite their reputation for bravery, looked at the human with newfound respect. The fernling skin showed colors that Jake had learned indicated deep curiosity mixed with caution. Humans didn't survive by running away or hiding in caves. Jake continued, walking slowly toward the center of the room as he spoke. "We survived by learning to think like predators, to understand their behavior, and when necessary, to face them on equal terms. We became persistence hunters, capable of tracking prey across vast distances. We learned to work in teams, to use tools, and project confidence even when facing creatures much more powerful than ourselves." Professor Kethvar was frantically taking notes on his research tablet, his four arms working independently as he tried to capture every word. This was groundbreaking information that would revolutionize the galaxy's understanding of human evolution and capabilities. "What you just witnessed wasn't magic or luck," Jake said, looking around at his classmates who were still maintaining a respectful distance from him. "It was millions of years of evolution. Humans learned to communicate with other predators through body language, posture, and presence. We developed instincts that allowed us to recognize and respond to threats before they became lethal." As Jake finished speaking, the other students began to file out of the classroom, but their behavior had changed completely. Where before they had simply ignored the human or treated him as a curiosity from a backward world, now they gave him a wide, respectful berth. The Etherians bowed slightly as they passed, their musical voices murmuring what sounded like thanks. The Volcari nodded with the kind of acknowledgement they typically reserve for respected colleagues and professors. Professor Kethvar remained behind, still furiously typing notes that would eventually be published as one of the most important xenobiology papers in galactic history. The day that started as a simple lesson about predator behavior had become the moment when the galaxy learned that humans weren't the weak, primitive creatures everyone had assumed them to be. They were apex predators who had earned their place among the stars.